Our presentation today will be focusing on the National Flood Insurance Program's Agent's Lowest Floor Guide. As we look deeper into the Lowest Floor Guide, we will be concentrating on the National Flood Insurance Program's three basic types of structures. Once the basic types of structures have been identified, these types will then be divided into 11 different diagram numbers. Finally, we will connect the elevation certificate with the 11 diagrams. While we are not looking at the various components of the elevation certificate, both the elevation certificate and the lowest floor guide are critical tools used for determining rates. Sections A through C of the elevation certificate provide lines for entering numerous measurements the surveyor must record in completing the elevation certificate. This data will be used to help insurance agents accurately rate a flood policy and assist FEMA and the local communities with their floodplain management and compliance issues. The lowest floor guide, on the other hand, is used by insurance agents in conjunction with the elevation certificate to assist in determining the lowest floor for rating. The National Flood Insurance Program divides structures into three basic types: slab on grade, basement, or elevated. These three types are then divided into 11 different diagram numbers on the agent's lowest floor guide. As we see on our screen, each diagram includes a basic outline of the structure. It indicates where the next higher floor is located, as well as the bottom floor is located in relation to the natural grade of the land. The lowest floor guide also ties into the elevation certificate. The circled letters and numbers on the building diagram correspond to the elevations that are entered in items C2A through H of the elevation certificate. Diagram 1A describes a slab on grade. These types of structures are built on a cement slab foundation, which is poured at ground level. The floor for rating for a diagram 1A will be C2A on the elevation certificate, or the top of the bottom floor, which is the top of that poured cement slab as indicated on our slide. The bottom floor is at or above ground level or grade on at least one side. Diagram 1B is very similar to a diagram 1A. However, the diagram 1B has a raised slab or stem wall construction. At the start of construction, footers are dug and concrete is poured in a trench. A perimeter of blocks is then erected on top of the footers that were dug. Backfill is then brought inside the perimeter of the block, allowing the foundation to be poured on top of the fill. This type of construction is still considered a slab foundation. However, the slab is thicker than what we would find in a diagram 1A. The top of the raised slab is indicated on line C2A from the elevation certificate and is also considered the lowest floor. The second basic type of structure is a structure with a basement or subgrade. In the flood program, the term subgrade just means below ground. To be considered a basement or subgrade, all walls of the structure are either partially or completely below ground. Basement, or an area below ground level, can also apply to a single room. The sunken room, often called a Florida room, was popular a few years ago. It's often found in the living room. The room was built so that a person would walk downstairs to access a portion of that room. If all sides of that room were placed below ground level and the builder dug below the ground in order to place those walls, that would be considered a basement. The lowest floor is still C2A from the elevation certificate. However, in a basement, C2A is below ground. Diagram 2B is also a basement, meaning all sides are below ground. However, a 2B has an area of egress that's also below ground level on all sides. C2A is still the lowest floor, which is also below ground on all sides. The difference between a diagram 2A and 2B is simply the area of egress. Diagrams 3 and 4 are dedicated to multi-level or split-level structures. These types of structures are divided vertically, so the floor level, or rooms in one part, are approximately midway between the levels of two successive stories in an adjoining part. For both structures, C2A from the elevation certificate remains the lowest floor. However, in diagram 4, C2A could be below ground, while C2A from a diagram 3 is at ground level. The third type of structure in the flood program is an elevated building. An elevated building is a structure that has its lowest floor elevated off the ground. Elevated buildings includes diagrams 5 through 8 in the agent's lowest floor guide. When dealing with compliance and elevated buildings, some additional considerations must be made. If the building has an enclosure, how is the building enclosure used? What is the flood zone in that particular building? Does the building have proper venting if that structure is located in zones beginning with the letter A, or if in a V zone, does the enclosure have breakaway walls? If applicable, the location of machinery and equipment must also be considered. In the previous slide, I mentioned that one consideration for elevated structures is compliant venting in an enclosure of a building that's in a zone beginning with the letter A. A flood vent is designed to equalize the hydrostatic pressure that's accumulating as water is pressing against a foundation. In order to properly release that pressure, there must be a minimum of 2 flood vents on 2 different sides of the enclosure. There also has to be 1 square inch of venting per 1 square foot of enclosure space. These vents can be no more than 1 foot off the ground. The 1 foot measurement is taken from the bottom of the vent. These vents must also be permanently open without human intervention. For this reason, windows or doors do not qualify for compliant venting. Diagram 5 is an elevated building without an enclosure. These structures are elevated with pilings, posts, piers, columns, or parallel shear walls, allowing the water to freely flow underneath. To meet floodplain regulations, the lowest floor of these structures should be elevated at or above the base flood elevation. The floor for rating on a diagram 5 is C2A from the elevation certificate. However, C2A is above the base flood elevation. Diagram 6 on the lowest floor guide is an elevated structure that has a partial enclosure below the lowest elevated living floor. These structures are also constructed on posts, piers, pilings, columns, or parallel shear walls, only they have an area in that elevated section that's enclosed. The regulations for these partial enclosures are different according to the flood zone. For A zones, a structure with a partial enclosure needs to meet the venting criteria that was stated in the previous slide. If the structure we see on our screen meets the venting criteria, the floor used for rating would be C2B, or the top of the next higher floor. If the partial enclosure is not properly vented, the floor used for rating will be the top of the bottom floor, or C2A from the elevation certificate. The particulars regarding V zones will be discussed in just a few minutes. Walkouts are considered to be an elevated building. These structures are at diagram 7 from the agent's lowest floor guide. 3 walls of these types of structures are below the natural grade, leaving one side at ground level, so a person could walk out at that level. Walkouts that are located in zones beginning with the letter A must also meet the venting criteria if the top of the next higher floor is to be used for rating. Walkouts are not considered a basement because all walls of that structure are not below ground. Diagram 8 is yet another type of elevated building. This particular structure is built on a crawl space. Instead of being elevated on piers, post piles, columns, or parallel shear walls, this type of structure is raised on a solid foundation perimeter wall with a crawl space below the lowest living floor. Since the walls are solid and not designed to let the floodwaters flow freely, this type of structure has to meet the venting criteria that we discussed earlier in order to equalize the hydrostatic pressure if a flood event occurs. If the venting criteria are met, the floor used for rating will be C2B, which is the top of the next higher floor. If the venting criteria are not met, the floor used for rating would be C2A, or the top of the bottom floor. A very common question anytime we talk about crawl spaces is what makes a crawl space different. In order to be considered a crawl space, the distance between the top of the bottom floor and the top of the next higher floor is no more than 5 feet. Diagram 9 is also an elevated structure with a crawl space, so the rules and regulations stated in the previous slide will be applied. Also, if this type of structure is located in a zone beginning with the letter A, the venting criteria must also be met. If the venting criteria is met, the floor used for rating would be C2B, which is the top of the next higher floor. If the venting criteria are not met, the floor used for rating would be C2A, which is the top of the bottom floor. What makes this type of structure different from what we just talked about in a diagram 8? Both the diagram 8 and 9 have no more than 5 feet between the top of the bottom floor and the next higher floor. However, in a subgrade crawl space, the bottom floor is no more than 2 feet below ground. Compliant in V zones is different than that in A zones because instead of the water accumulating as it does in A zones, the water in V zones has velocity and wave action. For this reason, venting is not a consideration in a V zone. Also, because of the force of the wave action, the lowest floor is considered to be the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member, which is the lowest floor beam, C2C on the elevation certificate. An enclosure in a V zone has a totally different set of qualifications to make it compliant than what we discussed in A zones. In order to meet compliance, the enclosure must be constructed of breakaway walls, be less than 299 square feet or less in size. The space must also be unfinished and used for parking, storage, and building access only. Any machinery and equipment must be elevated at or above the base flood elevation. If compliant, an enclosure in a V zone would rate from C2C of the elevation certificate. However, if the enclosure is not compliant, the floor for rating would be C2A minus a foot or 1.5 feet for commercial structures. If you're looking for additional information regarding the flood program, my suggestion is to opt in to NFS email communications. If you're looking for marketing materials, check out www.agents.floodsmart.gov. Thank you for joining me as we took a deeper look into the Agent's Lowest Floor Guide. We hope you'll join us on another session.